Good morning. It is 9:34 a.m. on Sunday, September 24th, 2017. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. And it is Sunday, which means it's time to continue my rewatch of Avatar: The Last Airbender with Season 3, Episode 17, The Ember Island Players. This is a fun episode with a somewhat ominous ending. But I think part of what just makes it so memorable, of course, is that it is the creators giving themselves kind of one last opportunity for just silliness and the idea of getting all of the meta commentary and inside jokes out of the way before the last 4 episodes are all big series conclusion stuff. So this is the last opportunity. First, it allows for a little bit of a recap of the whole story, a reminder for the audience of like, hey, remember all of these things that we've been through together. But then also to, play with themselves, make inside jokes, have the characters reflect on things. It also obviously brings up, gives us opportunity to remind everyone and the characters themselves about some of their own current places on their emotional arcs and all of that sort of thing. And then setting it up. So in many respects, like there's not really anything that happens in this one that like has to be there. Like if this episode just didn't appear, I don't know that anyone would miss it or feel like, well, wait, what happened? Why are what's changed? Maybe Aang and Katara being a little more awkward with each other. But that's, I think, the only thing. So we start the episode with the team having made their way to the Ember Island house that we saw on the Ember Island episode earlier this season. We're reminded by Zuko that the family doesn't stay there anymore, not since the family was all together and happy. So he thought it would be a good place to hide where no one would think to look for them. And we can see that Avatar's or Aang's firebending has been coming along nicely. We see him training, practicing more with Zuko. And then we hear about the Ember Island players have been putting on are putting on a play called The Boy in the Iceberg, and I'm not going to do a catalog of every single inside joke in this episode just because it would take forever and why. You could just look at a wiki for that. But, some of the notable things, for example, The Boy in the Iceberg is the name of the first episode of the series, and the poster is kind of a playful version or take on the artwork from the season 1, like DVD box poster style, and so the idea that first it's a little bit potentially risky. Like, don't you think it'd be possible that they could get recognized going to see a play about themselves? But at the same time, how could they resist? Really, right? I mean, but we're also given a setup that Zuko knows the Ember Island players from when he was a kid and thinks of them as the people who have butchered a play called Love Amongst the Dragons, and he was forced to see it every year when he was a kid. His mom apparently liked it or liked going to it. And so we're given that kind of an expectation going in of like, there's also a fun little joke about how the author, consulted many sources to gain this story, including a surprisingly knowledgeable cabbage merchant. We haven't seen the cabbage merchant in a while, but we can just certainly remember there's been multiple installments over the course of the series of his poor cabbages being wrecked by the antics of Team Avatar. But the whole episode, obviously, again, without just going into a beat by beat recounting of every inside joke in the series, it's a perfect opportunity for the creators to, engage in some of the, fan community discussion a little bit, play with that, be playful about it, and put the characters in the position of us, the viewers, for a little while, and that's kind of fun. And so, in our first segment of the play, mostly what we see is Katara sees herself depicted as extremely overwrought, over emotional, always crying and going on and on about hope. And, she's very insistent to say, oh, I don't sound like that. Whereas everyone else is saying, yeah, maybe a little. And then likewise, the character of Sokka in the play is just always talking about how hungry he is and how much he wants meat, and then that's it. And Sokka is kind of like, wait, that's not, my jokes are better than that. And everyone's still like, well, yeah. So, and then of course, the idea that the actor playing Aang is actually a woman, and definitely in terms of the presentation, the performance is kind of evoking the way that traditionally in productions of Peter Pan, the actor playing Peter Pan is a woman. And, so there's kind of an honoring to that, but also just the idea that the impishness of Aang's character, especially early on in the series, like everyone else is like, well, she's not as far off as you think. And I think part of Aang's resistance to that is it's all tied into this idea that he's feeling anxiety about his feelings for Katara and that she doesn't seem to return them, and his fear that she does see him as just like a brother. And so him wanting to be thinking of himself as more manly is probably tied up with that. And so, to be sure, the way his character is being portrayed in this play would make it very difficult to have the play replicate what he hopes to happen, which is a romance with Katara, right? And in the meantime, it also just makes him look a lot sillier. And, whereas while he has a very silly side, of course, he takes, his view of his mission very seriously. And in fact, a lot of the silliness tends to be deflection, because he uses it to kind of cope with how everything in his life is life or death and world ending. But in the meantime, Toph and then of course Zuko is depicted as totally humorless. The actor has a mask to make the scar, but it's on the wrong side, and we see him, just berating his uncle, and looking for his honor. And once again, everyone depicted that up to that point hates the depiction of themselves, and everyone else is like, well, yeah, kinda. And then in the meantime, Toph, who hasn't shown up yet, is having a great time insisting to everyone, nope, they're nailing all of you. And that's a setup which I think is really interesting in the sense that it kind of leads us to expect that when when Toph's counterpart shows up, she's not going to like that, and it'll be a time for a reversal. Everyone to say, well, you were laughing at us, now we get to laugh at you. And then sure enough, Toph shows up in the play as a big burly man who, instead of seeing through vibrations, it does it like echolocating and just screams in all their faces and says, yeah, there, I got a good look at you. And everyone's expecting that to be the situation, that she's not going to like that, and then now they get to tease her, but she loves it, which is kind of another fun twist. And it does seem kind of in keeping with Toph that, in some ways, because she has her own issues with her background. Like, we had the episode earlier this season where she tried to come to peace with her parents a little bit, and that whole situation. But, her actual background is pretty painful for her. So the idea that the character version of her would just dispense with all of that and just be tough and about fighting, we can definitely see how that would appeal to her. So it does feel in character for her to react that way, even if it's a little surprising. Like, we don't necessarily expect it. The tropes of cartoons kind of lead us to expect one particular kind of comic response, but then, the one that actually happens is simultaneously surprising, but also feels right when it happens, I think. But so in the meantime, in this sort of second segment of the play, we start getting into some of the things that are a little more painful for all of our heroes to recall. For example, there's stuff dealing with Jet, the first encounter showing the actress version of Katara really admiring Jet for destroying the village and saying, "Oh, you're so bad," when we know that obviously it was a much more complex thing than that, that was the plan that made her realize that he was bad despite being superficially charming, and that, it was what led her to, turn against him. And then, of course, we have the follow-up with Jet, where he's, in the play, mind controlled, and then a weird rock kind of falls on him. And there's a nice joke for the series of just saying, did Jet just die? And Sokka saying, it's really unclear. Because, of course, how in the episode in question, Jet's fate was made kind of unclear. I mean, we're kind of given the impression that he maybe is gonna die, and they leave him in a tough situation where it's not clear how he would ever get out or what hope there could be. But we don't actually see him die, and he's just never referred to again. So is that a case of we're meant to assume that he did die, but they just didn't want to show it because it's a kids show? Honestly, that's might well be the answer, but it was never confirmed. So I like that they're joking about that. But of course, just Jet's fate and his nature is something that Katara has a hard time thinking about. And then, of course, Zuko gets to see his own, treachery and betrayals and all of that sort of thing thrown back at him. A scene depicting him turning on his uncle. Their initial split, suggesting that it was just because Iroh didn't like the way Zuko was growing his hair. And then, of course, the later one, Zuko, this is more painful for him because it's fresh and he does feel like, this is his biggest regret, as he says, and now this play is kind of just making a joke of it, and yet he can see some truth in it showing him betraying his uncle, and he's like, yes, I did do that, and that's painful. And I loved, though, having Toph be the one to kind of tell him, it's like, you feel like you worry that you'll never get to redeem yourself because, what if you never are able to meet him up with him again? But she can confirm, I got to talk with your uncle, and I know what he thought of you and what he talked about and what he wanted for you, and you are doing it, and so I know that he would be proud of you. And that's a great sort of additional bonding between the two of them, because, of course, unlike with Katara and Sokka and Aang each getting their field trip episode with him, we didn't have one that was specifically Toph and Zuko, although she was the one that was already more inclined to bring him in from the beginning because she didn't have those same sorts of personal resistances the way everyone else did. So she was more open to begin with, but that said, she was open to him in kind of a superficial way, and now they're connecting on a deeper level, which is nice. We get the moment of Sokka, who is still largely comic in this episode. We don't see him dealing with this much really tough emotion, although even when, for example, we see the scene showing Princess Yue becoming the moon. And we see that even though the scene is kind of silly in the play, that it's obviously something that still means a lot to Sokka. He's tearing up, and Suki actually is like, oh, I didn't know you kissed the moon. And she's like, 1 minute, I'm trying to watch. And she looks like she's mad at first, but then later we have a little bit of a back and forth where she agrees to help him sneak backstage to give joke lines to the actor, who loves them, of course, and then uses some of those in the follow-up scene. So out of everybody, Sokka is really, I think, the most happy with the play overall. No question about it. And so that's kind of fun that Sokka, in many ways, is much more, I think, comfortable with himself, in the sense that his biggest insecurity over the course of the season has always just been, trying to be the responsible one, trying to, for example, when he had to take charge during the invasion and worrying that he failed everyone, when, everything went south there. But having been able to rescue his father, I think, went a long way towards resolving that anxiety. And so he's still very much convinced that they're all on a mission here, and that's very important, but he has mostly resolved his own personal insecurities. He's a little ahead of everybody else in terms of his own emotional journey for right now, but he's still kind of, the thing with Suki is new, and, he's still kind of feeling that out, so to speak. And, having them have a little bit of friction in this episode, but still kind of partners in crime, sneaking him backstage and everything is nice to see. And then, of course, we have Katara and Aang. And we see the scene in which he actually kissed her before the invasion, but now in the play, it's only a friendly handshake because, of course, she loves him like a brother and he wouldn't want it any other way, when we know that that's not only not what happened, but not how they feel. And that's much harder for Aang to deal with. And so we had at the beginning of the episode, like, him wanting to sit next to Katara, but then, Zuko ends up taking that spot and kind of not realizing what the problem is, and Aang being unable to communicate why he wanted to sit there. But, it ties back to that episode where, when I was discussing the episode with the invasion in it, and just kind of commenting on the complexity of that kiss. Because it was kind of a stolen kiss. And she did look a little bit embarrassed and flustered about it rather than, like, appreciative and happy. And that was awkward at the time, and they've never really dealt with that. And as they discuss out on the balcony, Katara is definitely just feeling like we're in the middle of a war. There's a lot to worry about. I'm confused. And we see him try again to steal a kiss. And this time she calls him on it, of just saying, like, what are you doing? I just said that I was confused. That was not the right answer. And of course, he recognizes as soon as she says that how dumb it was, and now everything is even more awkward, and that's where we are kind of leaving things for this episode, is that, he has made it clear, not only are his feelings still there, but he's getting frustrated and impatient, and she's still feeling confused, and she doesn't know what to think. And we get the impression from her that she's kind of been she's been in denial about it a little bit, and trying to just sort of push it off. And it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, she's kind of suggesting, like, well, now's not the right time because we're in the middle of a war. And he says, well, but then what would be the right time? And I think that there's two levels of conversation we can have about that. One is, of course, the idea that if you always put things off until, the right time, or when things are less crazy and everything, it's easy to put things off forever at that, if that's your standard. And so that is not necessarily a good reason to delay something if it is what you want. Don't necessarily put things off just because, it's like, oh, things are too crazy right now, because it might not ever stop being too crazy. And then you will just never do it, even if that's what you wanted. But the other layer of that conversation is it what she wants? Because at least from this episode, it sure doesn't seem like she's convinced of that. I mean, maybe it's not a definitive no, but she is certainly conflicted enough about her feelings that it's not just a case of her saying, well, I do want a relationship with you, but maybe not now. It seems a lot more like she doesn't know how she feels. And in that, situation, pushing harder the way Aang kind of tries to here, obviously just pushes her further away, because she's not prepared to let him in closer like that yet. So him trying to move in closer just makes her move away. The exact opposite of what he was hoping to accomplish there. So it's we are sad for both of them here, but I kind of like I like her sort of calling him on, trying to just randomly kiss her in the conversation again when she's not ready, or giving him any signal really that that's what she wants. I like that, whereas the last time it was a surprise and then it was so awkward that she kind of just didn't ever say anything about it. But this time, she's basically making it clear, no, don't do that. But of course it's, it's tricky. It's a tough situation for both of them in the sense that they're still pretty young, and the question of like, how does she feel about him? Well, certainly when they met him, she thought of him like a kid. We still have our opening credits where she's kind of just talking about how young and inexperienced he is. Now, he's obviously grown a lot over the course of the series, but does that change how she feels about him? Well, it's complicated, as shall be resolved through the rest of the series, all 4 episodes of it. But of course, we also get to the point in the play where everything has kind of caught up to the present, and yet the play is still going, and everyone's like, well, but wait, what? And, Sokka even goes, ooh, what if it's telling the future? And then they all have to hope that that's not true, because it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, they're seeing this in the Fire Nation, and so it seems reasonable to expect that it might be a little bit of Fire Nation propaganda, right? On the other hand, it's interesting just in the details of the episode that it's actually, and the playwright is supposedly from the Earth Kingdom. They briefly, it's kind of a throwaway line, but they do say that. But in any event, the idea of, if this guy has written a play to be performed in the Fire Nation, a Fire Nation pleasing ending. Although it's interesting too, because as they watch this ending, where first Azula kills Zuko, and then the Fire Lord kills Aang, and then rises up basically saying, the world is mine! Some elements of what the Fire Nation populace think about all of this gets a little muddled, because in some ways we can remember that the justification to the Fire Nation for this war supposedly was all about, oh, we have to share our greatness with the rest of the world, as opposed to the ending of this play, which is obviously very much about Ozai saying, yes, the world is mine! Very, imperialistic and power hungry. But that said, it's all very simplistic, but it kind of also ties into the idea that for a lot of people in the Fire Nation, probably even if they kind of rationalize their support of the war and some of the bad stuff by the idea of, well, they're resisting us, so we have to stop them, but the point is still to, bring our greatness to the rest of the world. But at the same time, when appealed to emotionally, they are kind of on board with, like, yeah, Ozai's taking control and he's on my side, and so it's going to be good for us. And I think that that bears out a lot of how people actually act, and there's a little bit of politics of that, right? Of, you know, what happens when the guy you've chosen as your guy says awful things. Like, does that make you turn on them, or does that make you jump up and applaud for those awful things? Anyway, not to make this too political, but but yeah, the idea that this ending was propaganda of, oh, and then all of our guys die and the Fire Lord wins, is kind of takes the silliness of the episode and turns it a bit back more towards, oh yeah, we have a very serious thing to deal with. And that, of course, we have a 4-part finale that is literally Sozin's Comet, parts 1 through 4 for the remaining 4 episodes. And we'll have to deal with all of those things. And of course, we really didn't get any more progress on the lingering question from last week, which was, if you, Aang, think that there's always a nonviolent solution, what's your plan for dealing with Ozai? We'll have to see. So, that is the Ember Island players. Next week, we'll be talking about Sozin's Comet Part 1. And as we count down only 4 remaining episodes of this in rewatch. And I think I maybe said last week, but I've decided that the rewatch series that I'm going to do after this one is Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, specifically the first season, because I think that, in my mind, of all of the bits I've seen, is the best Ghost in the Shell stuff. So, I will talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes. Kind of losing my voice.